Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're doing something a little different. No inbred Habsburgs, no royal meltdowns, no tragic princes coughing themselves into the history books. Tonight we're just going to float, gently, down the Nile. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Get horizontal. Let your eyes get heavy. Because tonight's story isn't about one dramatic life. It's about thousands of ordinary ones, stacked up over 3,000 years. In a narrow green ribbon of land surrounded by more sand than anyone could ever want. This is ancient Egypt, but not the tomb-robbing, curse of the mummy version. Just life. Slow, sun-baked, river-dependent life. So get comfortable. We're going in. Let's start with the river itself, because honestly, nothing in Egypt makes sense without it. The Nile flows north, which apparently confused a lot of early European travelers who assumed all rivers flowed south because, sure, why would rivers just do whatever they want? But the Nile does what it wants, and what it wants, every single year, is to flood. Not in a dramatic, disaster movie way. In a slow, predictable, almost polite way. Every summer, the river would rise, spill gently over its banks, and coat the fields in this rich black silt washed down from somewhere way up in the Ethiopian highlands. The Egyptians called the land Kemet, the Black Land, named after this silt, because apparently, the place where the mud is good, was branding they could get behind. This flood cycle was so reliable that the Egyptians built their entire calendar around it. 3 seasons, each about 4 months long. Okay, the flooding season. Parate, the growing season. Once the water receded and left behind soil so fertile you barely had to try. And Shimu, the harvest season, when everyone brought in the crops before the whole cycle started over again. No real winter, no real unpredictability. Just water, mud, and grain, on repeat, for thousands of years. It's honestly kind of soothing when you think about it. A civilization that ran on a schedule as steady as a heartbeat. Now, most people in ancient Egypt were farmers. Not pyramid architects, not high priests, not pharaohs with elaborate golden death masks. Just farmers. And their daily life, honestly, wasn't glamorous. But it also wasn't the miserable slog you might picture. During flood season, when the fields were underwater and there wasn't much farming to be done, a lot of these same farmers were pulled into labor projects, building temples, digging canals, and yes, working on those pyramids we all associate with Egypt. And here's a fun little correction the historians have been trying to hammer into pop culture for decades. These workers weren't slaves being whipped by shirtless overseers in a Cecil B. DeMille fever dream. They were, for the most part, paid laborers, fed a steady diet of bread and beer, working in rotating shifts as a kind of national service during the flood downtime. Archaeologists even found their worker villages near the Giza Plateau, complete with bakeries and breweries. Because if you're going to make people haul limestone blocks in the desert sun, you better believe you're keeping the beer supply strong. Speaking of bread and beer, let's just sit with that for a second, because it really was the backbone of the Egyptian diet. Bread wasn't a side dish. It was basically currency. Workers were often paid in bread and beer rations instead of coins, since coin money didn't really show up in Egypt until much later, borrowed from the Greeks. Beer, in particular, was thick, a little sour, somewhat porridge-like, and nutritionally speaking, actually pretty solid, full of carbs and vitamins, safer to drink than the river water half the time. Kids drank it too, weak versions of it anyway. Which, look, different era, different standards, let's not judge too hard from our couches 3,000 years later. Let's float over to the house itself. Because Egyptian homes were shaped almost entirely by climate logic. Mud brick walls, thick enough to keep the heat out during the day and the warmth in during cooler nights. Flat roofs, which weren't just architectural laziness. They were extra living space. Families would sleep up there in the hot months, catching whatever breeze wandered by. Windows were small and set high, again to keep the sun and dust out, which meant the inside of most homes stayed dim and relatively cool, kind of like a permanent nap-friendly cave. Honestly, ancient Egyptian architecture was optimized for exactly the kind of sleepy vibe we're going for tonight. Furniture was minimal. Most people sat on mats or low stools, and slept on simple beds with headrests instead of pillows, carved wooden or stone supports for the neck, which sounds deeply uncomfortable to us, but which Egyptians apparently found perfectly fine, possibly because there was no alternative and possibly because after a full day hauling irrigation buckets, you'd sleep on a rock if it was flat enough. Now here's where things get a little more personal, because Egyptian families were, structurally speaking, kind of ahead of their time. Marriages were arranged, sure, mostly for practical and economic reasons. But Egyptian women had a surprising amount of legal independence compared to a lot of other ancient societies. They could own property, they could initiate divorce, they could run businesses. A woman in ancient Egypt had more legal standing than, say, a woman in classical Athens, which is a genuinely strange twist of history considering how much cultural cachet the Greeks get for being the birthplace of civilization. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were quietly over here letting women inherit land like it was no big deal. Children, meanwhile, ran around mostly naked until about age 6 or so, because in that heat, clothing was optional and honestly kind of pointless. Once they hit a certain age, boys would often follow their fathers into a trade: farming, pottery, metalwork, scribal work if the family had any pull, while girls learned household management, weaving, and food preparation from their mothers. Education, formal education anyway, was mostly reserved for the sons of officials and the elite, funneled into scribal schools where boys learned hieroglyphics through what was apparently an aggressively repetitive and occasionally physically punishing system. There's a surviving Egyptian text where a scribe basically tells his student, "A boy's ear is on his back, he listens when he is beaten," which, yikes. But also, very consistent with several other ancient education systems that were similarly unbothered by modern parenting standards. If you did make it through scribal training, though, congratulations, you'd basically hit the jackpot of ancient career paths. Scribes were exempt from manual labor, they had steady government work, and they had access to a level of literacy that maybe 1% of the population ever achieved. Hieroglyphics were beautiful, sure, but wildly impractical for daily use. Hundreds of symbols, slow to write, mostly reserved for temple walls and monuments. For actual day-to-day paperwork, scribes used a faster cursive script called hieratic, written on papyrus with reed pens and ink made from soot or ochre. Papyrus itself was made from the papyrus plant that grew along the marshy edges of the Nile, sliced into strips, layered, pressed, and dried into a surprisingly durable writing material. The stuff survived in the dry Egyptian climate for thousands of years, which is honestly more than we can say for most modern printer paper. Let's drift, gently, toward food, because it's such a core part of understanding how these people actually lived. Bread and beer formed the base, as mentioned, but Egyptians also had a fairly varied diet depending on their social class. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce were common. Lentils and beans provided protein. Fruit like figs, dates, and pomegranates rounded things out. Meat was more of a luxury. Cattle, sheep, and goats were valuable enough that they weren't eaten casually, though fish from the Nile itself was a much more regular protein source for the average family, caught with nets, traps, or simple hooks. The wealthy could afford beef more often, along with imported wine, while the average farming family stuck mostly to bread, beer, vegetables, and the occasional fish stew. Bees, interestingly, were domesticated for honey, which functioned as Egypt's main sweetener, since sugar as we know it wouldn't exist in the region for centuries. Honey was valuable enough that it shows up constantly in temple offerings and medical texts, which, speaking of medicine, Egyptian doctors were surprisingly advanced for their era. They understood basic wound care, splinting for broken bones, and even had specialists, kind of like an ancient version of seeing a dentist versus a general practitioner. Some of it strayed into magic and incantations, sure, because germ theory was a solid 2,000 years away, but a decent chunk of their medical knowledge held up. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, reads almost like a clinical manual, describing injuries, diagnoses, and treatments in this weirdly calm, procedural tone. Very on brand for tonight's vibe, honestly. So that's where we'll pause for now. The river, the seasons, the mud brick houses, the bread, the beer, the scribes hunched over papyrus in some dim little room off a temple courtyard. Just people, living their quiet, sun-warmed lives along the same river their ancestors had lived beside for generations before them, and their descendants would keep living beside for generations after. Let's float onward, next, into the world of work, craft, and the strange, specific rhythms of Egyptian daily labor, because there's a lot more gentle detail to drift through before we're done. Alright, let's keep floating. Last time we left off drifting through scribal schools and honey jars, so let's ease into the world of work now. Because ancient Egypt had this wonderfully specific, almost obsessive relationship with craftsmanship. Everything had its own guild-like structure, its own set of tools, its own quiet traditions passed down from father to son, generation after generation, in workshops that probably smelled like sawdust, hot metal, and river mud. Take carpentry, for instance. Egypt wasn't exactly blessed with great timber. Most of the good wood, cedar, mostly, had to be imported from Lebanon, shipped down the Mediterranean coast and into the Nile Delta. Local wood, like acacia and sycamore, was serviceable but knotty and short, which meant Egyptian furniture makers got very good at joining small pieces together with pegs, dovetails, and mortise and tenon joints. It's kind of impressive, actually. Some of their wooden joints have survived thousands of years in tombs, still holding together better than some flat-pack furniture assembled last weekend. Then there's pottery, which honestly might be one of the most quietly essential crafts in the entire civilization. Nearly everything got stored in pottery: grain, beer, wine, oils, ointments. And Egyptian potters worked with simple wheels, shaping wet Nile clay into these round-bottomed jars that could be easily transported by boat or balanced on someone's head, which, if you've never tried it, is a genuinely impressive skill. The clay itself came in two basic types: a coarse, reddish Nile silt clay for everyday storage jars, and a finer, pale marl clay from the desert edges for higher quality vessels. Different clay, different purpose, different price point. Very sensible system, really. Metalworking followed a similar arc of gradual improvement. Early Egyptians worked mostly with copper, which is soft and easy to shape but doesn't hold much of an edge. Eventually bronze came into the picture, an alloy of copper and tin, which made for sturdier tools and weapons. Iron came later, and interestingly, iron was actually rarer and more prestigious than gold for a while in early Egypt, mostly because they didn't yet have reliable local sources and had to import it. Plus the smelting technology was trickier, which is a funny little inversion when you think about how casually available iron eventually became. Gold, meanwhile, was Egypt's real specialty. They had access to gold mines in the eastern desert and down in Nubia, and Egyptian goldsmiths were remarkably skilled, hammering gold into thin sheets for gilding statues and coffins, casting jewelry, inlaying it with semi-precious stones like turquoise, carnelian, and lapis lazuli, the last of which had to be imported all the way from what's now Afghanistan, which really tells you something about how far Egyptian trade networks stretched, even in periods we tend to imagine as fairly isolated. Let's drift over to textiles for a second, because Egypt ran almost entirely on linen. Cotton wasn't really in the picture yet, at least not locally, so flax was the crop of choice, grown along the Nile, harvested, then soaked, beaten, and spun into thread by women working at home or in small workshops. Egyptian linen ranged from coarse, practical fabric worn by laborers to gossamer thin, almost transparent cloth worn by elites. So fine that some tomb paintings show nobles wearing what looks like barely anything at all. Which, again, understandable in that heat. Dyeing wasn't super common. Most linen stayed its natural pale color, though wealthier Egyptians sometimes had access to dyed textiles in blue, red, or yellow, using plant-based dyes that were labor-intensive to produce and therefore reserved mostly for special occasions or ceremonial wear. Now let's talk trade, because Egypt wasn't some sealed-off bubble floating in isolation along its river. It traded constantly, and fairly extensively. Boats moved up and down the Nile carrying grain, pottery, and stone, while larger seafaring expeditions pushed out into the Mediterranean and down the Red Sea. One of the more famous expeditions was sent by Queen Hatshepsut down to the land of Punt, likely somewhere around modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, though the exact location is still debated, bringing back incense, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, and myrrh trees, which were apparently planted right at her mortuary temple, because if you're going to commission a massive trade expedition, you might as well bring home the receipts in botanical form. Markets themselves were fairly informal by later standards. There wasn't really coined currency for most of Egyptian history. That came in much later with Persian and Greek influence. So trade ran mostly on a barter system, with grain acting as a kind of unofficial standard of value. You wanted a jug of beer, you might trade a basket of onions for it. You wanted a new pair of sandals, maybe you'd offer up some woven cloth. Prices were sort of understood culturally rather than fixed on any formal scale, and scribes kept meticulous records of these exchanges anyway, because Egyptian bureaucracy loved paperwork almost as much as it loved the afterlife. Speaking of bureaucracy, Egypt ran on an absolutely enormous administrative system, and honestly, that's part of why we know so much about daily life here compared to a lot of other ancient civilizations. Scribes recorded harvest yields, tax assessments, temple inventories, court cases, construction projects. Basically anything that moved got written down somewhere. Taxes, by the way, weren't paid in coin. They were paid in grain, livestock, labor, or goods, collected by local officials and funneled up through a fairly rigid hierarchy that eventually reported to the vizier, who reported to the pharaoh. It's a system that, honestly, sounds exhausting, but it kept remarkably detailed records for thousands of years, which is more than most modern institutions manage over a single fiscal quarter. Let's ease into religion for a bit, since it wasn't really separate from daily life so much as woven directly into it. Egyptians worshipped an enormous, ever-shifting pantheon of gods. Ra, the sun god; Osiris, god of the afterlife; Isis, his devoted wife; Horus, their falcon-headed son; Anubis, who handled the whole embalming and afterlife weighing situation; and dozens upon dozens more, some regional, some rising and falling in popularity depending on which dynasty happened to favor which deity. Most temples weren't public spaces the way we imagine churches or mosques today. Ordinary Egyptians rarely went inside the main temple sanctuaries. Those were reserved for priests, who performed daily rituals of washing, dressing, and feeding the god's statue like it was, well, a very important and very passive house guest. Reminder Ibn. Common people worship mostly at home, or at small shrines, or during public festivals when the god's statue would be paraded through town in a covered bark, and that was basically everyone's chance to get close to the divine without actually setting foot in the temple's inner chambers. Household worship often centered on more approachable, domestic deities. Bes, a squat, grinning dwarf god who protected against evil spirits and looked after childbirth, and Tauret, a hippopotamus-headed goddess who also handled fertility and protection. Honestly, Bes has one of the more relaxed vibes of any ancient deity, just a chill little guardian spirit standing watch over your home. No elaborate demands, no grand temple required. Festivals themselves were a huge part of the social calendar. The Opet festival in Thebes, for instance, involved a massive procession where the statue of Ammonius traveled from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, accompanied by music, dancing, and offerings, essentially functioning as this huge public holiday that doubled as religious observance and community celebration. People took the day off, ate well, drank more beer than usual, and generally treated it like the ancient equivalent of a long weekend. Let's drift, finally, toward death, though gently. No dramatic reveals here, just the practical side of things. Death in Egypt wasn't treated as an ending so much as a transition, and because of that, an enormous amount of daily life energy went into preparing for it. Mummification was the most famous piece of this, of course, but it wasn't universally available. Full, elaborate mummification with all 70 days of the process. Removing organs, drying the body with natron salt, wrapping it in layers of linen, was expensive, reserved mostly for the wealthy and the royal. Poorer Egyptians were often buried more simply, sometimes just wrapped in cloth and placed directly in the hot desert sand, which, funnily enough, sometimes preserved bodies almost as well through simple natural desiccation, no elaborate embalming required. Tombs, similarly, scaled with wealth. The elite built elaborate rock-cut tombs filled with wall paintings depicting daily life, farming, feasting, hunting, dancing, basically a snapshot of what their owners hoped their afterlife would look like, an eternal continuation of the good parts of Egyptian daily existence. Ordinary people were buried more modestly, sometimes with a few simple grave goods like pottery, food offerings, or small amulets meant to ease the journey into the afterlife. So that's the shape of it, roughly. The workshops, the markets, the quiet daily rituals, the small household gods keeping watch over mud brick homes. A civilization built on rhythm, repetition, and remarkably detailed bookkeeping. Let's keep floating, next, into the world of the pharaohs themselves, and how, even at the very top of Egyptian society, life was still shaped by many of these same rhythms of river, ritual, and record-keeping, just on a much grander scale. Okay, let's keep drifting. We've covered the farmers, the craftsmen, the scribes hunched over their papyrus. Now let's ease upward, gently, toward the top of the pyramid, pun fully intended, and talk about the pharaoh himself. Pine decoration, or occasionally herself, though we'll get to that in a bit. Being pharaoh was, on paper, the best job in the ancient world. You were considered a living god, an intermediary between the divine and the mortal, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, this sort of cosmic balance and order that kept the whole universe from sliding into chaos. which sounds like a lot of pressure for one guy, and honestly it was. Every flood season, every harvest, every military campaign, every random bout of bad weather, somehow all of it reflected back on whether the pharaoh was doing his divine job correctly. Crops failed? Well, maybe Maat was a little off. Nile didn't flood high enough? Someone should probably check in with the God King about that. Despite the divine branding, pharaohs still had to actually run a country, which meant an enormous amount of very unglamorous administrative work. Tax collection, military organization, temple funding, diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers, all of it eventually crossed the pharaoh's desk, or throne, or whatever ancient equivalent of a desk existed at the time. Most of the actual day-to-day grind was handled by the vizier, kind of a prime minister figure, who oversaw the bureaucracy so the pharaoh could focus on being symbolically important, and occasionally showing up to cut a ceremonial ribbon, so to speak, at a new temple. Wrapped gift. Let's talk palace life for a second, since it's honestly a little less opulent than you'd expect, at least architecturally. Unlike the eternal stone temples and tombs Egyptians built to last forever, royal palaces were often made of mud brick, just like everyone else's homes, just, bigger, more elaborately painted, and considerably better furnished. The logic here is kind of interesting. Temples and tombs were meant for eternity, so they got the permanent stone treatment. Palaces were for the temporary business of actual living, so mud brick, which could be rebuilt or renovated as needed, was perfectly fine. It's a little humbling, honestly, that some of the most powerful people in the ancient world lived in buildings less structurally permanent than the tombs they were being prepped for. Royal wardrobes, on the other hand, were a whole production. Pharaohs wore fine pleated linen, dyed and decorated in ways ordinary Egyptians simply couldn't access, along with elaborate jewelry, collars made of gold and semi-precious stones, armbands, anklets, and of course, the iconic Nemes headdress, that striped cloth headpiece you've definitely seen on King Tut's golden mask. The pharaoh also carried symbolic items nearly everywhere. The crook and flail, representing kingship and, respectively, the shepherding of the people and the more disciplinary side of ruling. Very on-brand imagery, really, for a guy who was supposed to be both gentle protector and absolute authority at the same time. Now here's a fun quirk of Egyptian royal family structure that gets brought up a lot, usually with a slightly scandalized tone, and that's the whole sibling marriage situation. Pharaohs, particularly in certain dynasties, frequently married their sisters or half-sisters. This wasn't some private, whispered about secret. It was public, expected, and deeply tied to religious symbolism. The pharaoh was seen as a kind of earthly embodiment of the god Horus, whose parents, Osiris and Isis, were themselves siblings in Egyptian mythology. So when a pharaoh married his sister, he was, in a very literal sense, just following the divine template. It kept the bloodline pure, in a religious sense, and also, conveniently, kept power and land consolidated within the royal family instead of getting diluted out to some ambitious noble house through marriage. Now, we're not going to spiral into the whole Habsburg-style genetic catastrophe conversation tonight. That's a different video, for a different chill evening, but it is worth noting that this practice did occasionally cause exactly the kind of health issues you'd expect. Tutankhamun himself, that endlessly famous boy king, is a bit of a case study here. Genetic analysis of his mummy suggests his parents were likely siblings or very close relatives. And Tut himself had a cleft palate, a club foot, and needed canes to walk, several of which were actually found buried with him in his tomb. He also seems to have suffered from a weakened immune system and possibly malaria, based on DNA testing done on his remains. So the boy king, draped in solid gold and immortalized in one of the most famous funeral masks in human history, was, in reality, kind of a frail, sickly teenager who needed a walking stick to get around his own palace. Ironic contrast noted. Moving on gently, let's talk about royal women for a bit, because Egyptian queens had a genuinely unusual amount of power compared to their counterparts elsewhere in the ancient world. The title, Great Royal Wife, wasn't just ceremonial fluff. It came with real influence, land holdings, and religious authority. Some queens, like Nefertiti, appear in art wielding as much symbolic power as the pharaoh himself, shown in some reliefs smiting enemies in poses traditionally reserved for kings. And then, of course, there's Hatshepsut, who didn't just wield power adjacent to the throne. She just took the throne outright, declared herself pharaoh, and ruled for about 20 years, one of the longest and most prosperous reigns in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut's whole situation is honestly a masterclass in ancient PR management. Since the role of pharaoh was so deeply tied to masculine, divine kingship, she leaned hard into the imagery. Statues and reliefs commissioned during her reign frequently show her with the traditional false beard worn by pharaohs, and in a broad, muscular, stylized male form, even though everyone presumably knew she was a woman. It wasn't deception exactly, more like working within an existing visual language that simply had no template yet for female pharaoh, so she borrowed the male one wholesale. Smart, efficient, and honestly kind of savage in its practicality. After her death, her successor Thutmose III had many of her monuments defaced or her name chiseled out, which historians debate the reasons for endlessly. Political rivalry, an attempt to legitimize his own lineage, or simply restoring what he saw as proper dynastic order. Either way, it took modern archaeology to really restore her reputation as one of Egypt's most effective rulers. Let's float over to royal childhood for a moment, because pharaohs, despite their divine status, still had to actually grow up as children first, which comes with all the same developmental milestones as everyone else, just with significantly more gold jewelry involved. Royal children were raised largely by nurses and tutors, educated in reading, writing, religious ritual, and for the boys anyway, often trained in archery, horsemanship, and basic military strategy, since a pharaoh was also expected to function as commander-in-chief when the situation called for it. Royal daughters received education too, though generally focused more on religious and household administration roles they'd eventually be expected to fill. Interestingly, primogeniture, the eldest son automatically inheriting the throne, wasn't quite as ironclad in Egypt as you might expect. Succession was often more about which candidate had the strongest claim through both bloodline and, frankly, political maneuvering at court. This occasionally led to some fairly awkward succession situations, plotting between half-siblings, competing mothers pushing their own sons forward, officials backing different candidates for their own benefit. Very human stuff, dressed up in divine language, as usual. Let's talk briefly about royal leisure. Because even living gods needed downtime, hunting was a popular pastime, particularly hunting in the marshes for waterfowl using throwing sticks, a sport depicted constantly in tomb paintings, usually showing the pharaoh or noble standing gracefully in a small boat while a cat, of all animals, helps retrieve the birds. Yes, hunting cats. Egyptians loved cats enormously. They were associated with the goddess Batet, kept as household pets, and apparently trained, at least according to Tomb art, to assist with waterfowl hunting in the reeds. It's a delightfully specific and oddly domestic little detail buried in all this grandeur. Board games were also a major pastime across all social classes, but especially among the elite. Senet, probably the most famous, was a race-based board game involving throw sticks or knucklebone dice, played on a grid of 30 squares. It shows up constantly in tomb paintings and was even buried alongside the dead, since later religious texts started associating the game symbolically with the journey through the afterlife. Tutankhamun, in fact, was buried with several Senet boards, presumably to keep him entertained on his eternal journey, which, if nothing else, tells you the ancient Egyptians took their leisure activities seriously enough to want them in the next life too. Music and dance rounded out royal and elite entertainment, with harps, lutes, flutes, and percussion instruments accompanying feasts and festivals. Professional dancers and musicians, often depicted in flowing linen and elaborate wigs, performed at banquets, and tomb paintings frequently show these lively scenes of music and drink, essentially freezing in stone the ancient equivalent of a really good dinner party. So that's roughly the shape of pharaonic life, divine status wrapped around some very human realities. Sibling marriages justified through mythology, mud-brick palaces despite eternal stone tombs, sickly boy kings buried in solid gold, and female rulers borrowing beards to hold on to power in a system that had no other template for them. All of it stitched together by the same rhythms we talked about earlier: the flood, the harvest, the endless bureaucratic paperwork, just dressed up in slightly more gold leaf. Let's keep floating, next time, into the world of Egyptian belief about death and the afterlife in a bit more detail, along with how ordinary people, not just pharaohs, imagine their own eternal journey along a very different kind of river. Alright, keep settling in. Eyes getting heavy. Good. Let's drift now into the part of Egyptian life that was, paradoxically, the most carefully planned and the most expensively prepared for, and yet involved zero living participants. Death in ancient Egypt wasn't morbid exactly. It wasn't treated with the kind of hushed, uncomfortable energy we tend to bring to it today. It was practical, administrative, almost. Something to be organized, prepared for, budgeted around, and if possible, decorated nicely. The central idea behind all of it was fairly straightforward. Death wasn't an ending. It was a transition into another form of existence. One that mirrored this life closely enough that you'd want to bring most of your favorite things along with you. Food, furniture, clothing, tools, board games, little figurines of servants to do the agricultural labor you really didn't want to keep doing in the next life. All of it crammed into the tomb alongside the body, just in case the afterlife turned out to be exactly like this life. Just, hopefully, without the tax assessments. The Egyptian afterlife had several different conceptual layers that coexisted somewhat messily over the 3,000 years of the civilization, because Egyptian theology wasn't a neat, unified system so much as an enormous accumulation of regional beliefs and traditions that got layered on top of each other without anyone ever quite tidying up the contradictions. Which is very relatable, honestly, as a way of managing belief. One of the most persistent and widely understood concepts was the field of reeds, the Aru, which was essentially paradise conceived as a kind of idealized version of the Nile Delta. Lush fields, abundant crops, your deceased family members all there waiting for you, and no flood season that ever went wrong. It was a pleasant, low-key vision of eternity, not harps on clouds, not fire and brimstone, just a really good agricultural situation with good company and unlimited grain. Peaceful, very on brand for tonight. But getting there wasn't automatic. There was a process, and it involved, famously, the weighing of the heart. After death, the deceased soul, or more accurately, one of several spiritual components the Egyptians believed made up a person, since they had a fairly complex understanding of what constituted the self, would journey through the Duat, the underworld, navigating a series of gates and challenges until arriving in the Hall of Two Truths. There, in front of a divine tribunal presided over by Osiris himself, the dead person's heart would be weighed on a scale against a single white feather, the feather of Ma'at, representing truth, justice, and cosmic order. If your heart was heavy with misdeeds, the scale tipped, and waiting beside it was Ammit, a creature with the head of a crocodile, the front body of a lion, and the rear end of a hippopotamus, which is either a terrifying chimera or the most Egyptian combination of animals imaginable, depending on your perspective. Ammit would eat the heart, and the soul would cease to exist entirely. No afterlife, no field of reeds, just permanent obliteration. Not dramatic torture, not eternal punishment, just ending, like a candle going out. Somewhat more chilling, in its way, than fire and brimstone. If your heart balanced with the feather though, if you'd lived justly enough, treated people fairly, followed the basic ethical guidelines, then Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, would record the verdict, and you'd be ushered onward into Osiris's presence, and eventually into the field of reeds. Clean, efficient, nicely documented. Thoth taking notes on the whole thing is a very scribal touch for a theology built by people who genuinely believed in the administrative power of documentation. To help the deceased navigate all of this, Egyptians developed what we call the Book of the Dead, though they themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is a much nicer title honestly. It wasn't a single fixed text. It was more like a customizable collection of spells, prayers, and instructions, assembled individually for each person, rolled into a papyrus scroll, and placed in the tomb. You could buy a pre-written version with a blank space for your name to be filled in, which is either charmingly pragmatic or slightly deflating depending on how special you wanted your eternal journey to feel. The spells covered a lot of ground. There were spells for identifying yourself correctly to divine gatekeepers, spells for not being turned upside down and forced to eat excrement in the underworld, which apparently was a specific enough concern to warrant its own incantation. Spells for transforming into various animals to navigate different parts of the journey. And critically, spell number 125, the negative confession, a long list of things the deceased would declare they had not done. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused suffering. I have not taken the milk from the mouths of children. And so on, through an extensive catalog of ethical violations, all delivered directly to the divine tribunal as a kind of character testimony. The whole system had a wonderfully practical flaw, which is that anyone could commission a book of the dead with a very flattering negative confession, regardless of how they'd actually lived. The gods presumably knew this too, which is perhaps why the heart weighing existed as a kind of independent verification system. The spell could claim whatever it wanted, but the heart kept the real score. Rather poetic, honestly. Now, mummification was the physical side of all this preparation, the process that preserved the body so the soul would have somewhere recognizable to return to. The full, elaborate process took 70 days, which was a very specific number tied to religious significance. The 70 days the star Sirius disappeared below the horizon before rising again, associated with cycles of death and rebirth. The process was carried out by specialist embalmers who operated in workshops near the cemeteries, and who, depending on your budget, offered a sliding scale of service. The premium package involved removing the internal organs through a cut in the side, drying and storing them in canopic jars, 4 of them, each protected by a specific son of Horus with an appropriately themed head, packing the body cavity with natron salt and linen, anointing everything with resins and oils, and wrapping the whole thing in hundreds of yards of fine linen over the course of many days. Amulets were tucked between the layers as protection for the journey. The brain was removed through the nose, using a long hook, in a process that sounds about as pleasant as it reads, and mostly discarded, because the Egyptians didn't particularly value the brain as an organ. They thought it just produced mucus, basically. The heart, though, stayed in the body. Always. The heart was everything. Mid-range mummification was a more streamlined affair, injecting cedar oil into the body to dissolve the internal organs, then draining everything out before the natron treatment. Less dignified, but considerably cheaper. And at the budget end, as the Greek historian Herodotus matter-of-factly described it, you just got the natron treatment with minimal preparation and sent on your way. Still better than nothing, presumably. The canopic jars, by the way, are some of the more charming artifacts to come out of Egyptian tomb culture. The 4 sons of Horus each protected a specific organ. Imsidi, human-headed, guarded the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, had the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, took the stomach. And Kabasanuf, falcon-headed, handled the intestines. Specific, organized, and again, beautifully administrative. Even the internal organs had their own dedicated divine bureaucracy. Let's ease over to the priesthood now, since they were deeply intertwined with all of this afterlife infrastructure, as well as with the daily operation of every temple in Egypt. Priests in ancient Egypt were somewhat different from the image the word conjures in a modern context. They weren't full-time spiritual leaders in the modern pastoral sense. Many priests served in rotating monthly shifts, returning to ordinary civilian life between stints of temple service. During their rotation, they were required to maintain ritual purity, shaving their heads and bodies, abstaining from certain foods, washing themselves multiple times a day in sacred lakes attached to temple complexes. The actual work of temple priests was mostly custodial in a divine sense. Waking the god's statue, washing and dressing it, presenting it with food offerings, performing the daily rituals that maintained the god's presence in the temple, and then sealing the sanctuary again at night. It was repetitive, careful, and required considerable liturgical memorization. Kind of like the world's most elaborate housekeeping job, if the house belonged to a deity, and the cleaning schedule had cosmic consequences. Higher-ranking priests, like the high priest of Ammonius in Thebes, accumulated so much wealth, land, and political influence through the temple institution that they occasionally rivaled or even supplanted royal authority. In the later New Kingdom period, the high priests of Ammonius became so powerful that eventually one of them, Herihor, essentially took over as ruler of southern Egypt, while the pharaohs managed the north, which was an awkward arrangement that tells you a lot about how institutional wealth tends to accrue over centuries when you're the ones managing the country's most important religious real estate. Let's float down gently toward the ordinary person's relationship with all this death and divinity, because the elaborate temple rituals and expensive mummification packages were all well and good for the elite, but most Egyptians navigated their spiritual lives in considerably humbler ways. Home shrines, small clay or wooden figurines, simple amulets worn daily. These were the average Egyptian's practical toolkit for managing the divine. Little blue faience amulets shaped like the eye of Horus, the Wadjet eye, were worn for protection against evil and illness, and have survived in such enormous quantities that archaeologists find them constantly, in houses, in graves scattered through settlement debris. They were basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of something you'd have hanging from your rearview mirror, if your rearview mirror situation carried rather weightier cosmological implications. Shabdi figurines are another little charmer worth mentioning here. These were small mummiform figures placed in tombs, sometimes dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead that would animate them in the afterlife to perform agricultural labor on behalf of the deceased whenever the divine authorities called for it. Because even in paradise, apparently, someone had to tend the fields, and wealthy Egyptians saw absolutely no reason it should be them. Some tombs included Shabdi overseers as well, little figurine foremen to keep the worker Shabdas in line, which is possibly the most Egyptian detail in all of Egyptian archaeology. Outsourcing your afterlife labor, and then also hiring management to supervise the outsourcing. So there it is, the full shape of Egyptian death culture, from the weighing of the heart to the Shabdi middle management. Careful, organized, deeply symbolic, and running on a blend of genuine spiritual belief and very practical economic considerations. As most human institutions tend to, honestly. Let's keep drifting, next, into the world of Egyptian women in a bit more depth, their daily lives, their surprising legal freedoms, and a few specific women who left remarkably clear footprints in the historical record for a world that didn't always bother writing women's stories down. Good, you're still here. Still floating. Let's keep going. We talked briefly about Egyptian women earlier, touched on their legal independence, mentioned Hatshepsut and her borrowed beard. But there's considerably more to say, and it's worth saying slowly and in some detail, because the women of ancient Egypt occupy this genuinely fascinating space in history. More free than their contemporaries in most other ancient civilizations, still constrained in ways that were so normalized nobody particularly thought to write them down as constraints. Which is, of course, how most constraints work. Let's start with the basics. Egyptian women, across most periods of the civilization, had the legal right to own property independently of their husbands. They could buy and sell land, goods, and slaves. They could enter into contracts. They could sue in court and be sued themselves, which sounds less like a privilege and more like just being a person. But when you compare it to classical Athens, where women had essentially no legal personhood and required a male guardian to conduct any official transaction on their behalf, suddenly Egyptian women look remarkably well positioned. Greece gets a lot of historical credit for being the birthplace of democracy and rational thought, and yet Egyptian women were signing property deeds while Athenian women were legally classified somewhere between children and furniture. Just something to sit with. Marriage in Egypt was a practical arrangement, entered into without a formal religious ceremony in the way we'd recognize today. There was no priest presiding, no temple ritual required for an ordinary marriage. A couple essentially moved in together, and that was more or less it, socially understood as married from that point forward. Contracts were sometimes drawn up, particularly among wealthier families, outlining what each party brought to the arrangement, and what would happen to property in case of divorce. Because divorce was also perfectly legal, available to both parties, and not particularly stigmatized. A woman who initiated divorce could walk away with her dowry intact and, depending on the terms of any marriage contract, a portion of whatever property had been accumulated during the marriage. Remarriage after divorce was equally unremarkable. Widows remarried without any particular social penalty. This is, again, notably different from a lot of later Mediterranean and European societies where a widow's remarriage was either restricted, frowned upon, or complicated by inheritance laws designed to keep property in the deceased husband's family rather than follow the wife into a new union. Egypt, in its practical, river-bound way, seems to have understood that people needed to get on with their lives, and building enormous legal barriers around that wasn't particularly useful. Children, particularly sons, were important in marriage partly for the very practical reason that they would inherit and continue the family line, but also because caring for aging parents fell to children as a deeply understood social obligation. There's a surviving wisdom text, one of several collections of practical life advice that Egyptians were rather fond of composing, that specifically instructs men to honor and care for their mothers, noting that she carried him for 10 months, nursed him through childhood, and he would never fully repay at debt. Which is, honestly, a sentiment that translates across 3,000 years without any translation required whatsoever. Let's talk about working women specifically, because Egyptian women weren't confined purely to domestic roles, though domestic management was considered skilled and respected work in its own right. Women worked in textile production extensively. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were deeply female-dominated industries, with women working both in their homes and in larger institutional workshops attached to temples and palaces. Women served as professional mourners at funerals, a specialized role requiring the ability to weep expressively and at length on cue, which, paid performance art is paid performance art. Women worked as dancers and musicians, as market traders, as midwives, and in some periods as doctors. Female physicians appear in Egyptian records, though they're rare enough that each one tends to get a bit of historical attention. Peshet, who may have lived during the Old Kingdom period, is sometimes cited as potentially the earliest recorded female physician in history, though the evidence is somewhat indirect. She appears in a tomb inscription with a title that could be translated as Overseer of Female Physicians, which implies both that she held a supervisory medical role and that there were enough female physicians to require overseeing, which is itself a remarkable little data point. Priestesses existed throughout Egyptian history, though their roles shifted significantly across different periods and different temples. In some eras, women served as full temple priests alongside men. In others, their roles were more musical and ritual in nature. The role of chantress of Ammonius, for instance, was a prestigious title held by many noblewomen, involving singing and ritual music during temple ceremonies. The god's wife of Ammonius was an even more elevated title, held by women of royal blood, and carried with it enormous landholdings, a substantial household, and in some later periods, effectively the same political influence in Thebes that the high priest of Ammonius wielded. So women could, under the right circumstances, climb very near the top of the religious institutional hierarchy, which was also, essentially, the economic and political hierarchy. Let's ease into a few specific women worth knowing by name, because Egyptian women left enough documentary traces that we can actually sketch some individual lives, which is rarer than it should be for any ancient civilization. Nonakti is one of my quiet favorites. She was an ordinary woman, not royal, not noble, living in the artisan village of Deir el-Medina during the New Kingdom period, around the 12th century BC. Deir el-Medina was a purpose-built village housing the workmen who constructed the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, an unusually literate community, because the work required skilled craftsmen who could read and follow complex plans, and literacy rippled out to their families to a greater degree than in most Egyptian settlements. Because of this, we have an unusually rich documentary record from Deir el-Medina: letters, legal records, work logs, and personal documents that give us a remarkably intimate window into ordinary life. Nonakti's claim to historical fame is a will she dictated late in her life, which survives on papyrus and is one of the most personally vivid documents from the entire ancient world. In it, she methodically disinherited several of her children, by name, with her reasons stated clearly and without particular apology. She had, she explained, raised them, cared for them through their childhood, and now in her old age they had failed to care for her in return. Therefore, they would receive nothing from her estate. The children who had actually looked after her would inherit her goods. Cool, clear, entirely legal, and delivered with the serene finality of a woman who had absolutely made her peace with the decision. A woman exercising her legal rights 3,000 years ago to cut the ungrateful kids out of her will, and doing it in writing, is, frankly, a story that requires no embellishment or commentary. Let's float over to Nefertiti for a moment, because she's one of those historical figures who became famous for something relatively shallow, that famous bust in the Berlin Museum, the long neck, the painted face, and whose actual political significance tends to get somewhat buried under the aesthetic discussion. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the famously controversial king who upended centuries of Egyptian religious tradition by promoting the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, above all other gods, closing other temples, and relocating the royal court to a brand new city he built specifically for this theological experiment, which he called Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. Akhenaten is a whole separate conversation. The Amarna period is one of the most debated eras in all of Egyptology. But Nefertiti within that context appears in art and documentary records wielding remarkable power alongside him. She appears in scenes normally reserved for pharaohs, smiting enemies, presiding over religious rituals, depicted at essentially equal scale to her husband, which in Egyptian art was a very deliberate visual statement about status. Some scholars believe she may have ruled as pharaoh herself, under a male name, in the brief chaotic period after Akhenaten's death and before Tutankhamun's reign, though this remains debated and probably will remain debated for some time, because the evidence is tantalizingly incomplete, as the best historical mysteries tend to be. What happened to Nefertiti is similarly unclear. She simply disappears from the records around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why. She may have died. She may have fallen from power. She may have changed roles and names. Her mummy has never been definitively identified, though several candidates have been proposed over the years, and each proposed identification tends to generate a burst of excited headlines followed by a quieter academic consensus of probably not. So she remains, appropriately enough, somewhat beautifully mysterious. Her face one of the most recognizable in the ancient world, her actual life and death stubbornly resisting neat resolution. Let's drift gently toward the domestic rhythms of women's days, because beyond the famous names, there's a whole quiet texture to ordinary female life in Egypt worth sketching. Mornings likely began early, before the heat peaked, with bread making, grinding grain on a stone saddle quern, mixing dough, shaping loaves, and baking them in conical clay ovens that sat in courtyards or on rooftops. Grinding grain was physically demanding work, done on hands and knees, pushing a stone across another stone in a repetitive motion that left its traces on women's skeletons in the form of specific patterns of joint where that archaeologists can still identify thousands of years later. The work left marks on their bodies, as most daily work does, if you do it long enough. Water collection was another regular morning task, carrying heavy pottery jars to the river or to local wells, balanced on the head in that specific way that requires a kind of whole-body equilibrium that takes years to develop naturally and looks effortless once it does. Childcare wove through everything, nursing infants, managing toddlers, keeping track of older children while simultaneously managing the household economy, the cooking, the textile work, the food preservation through drying and salting, the basic medical care of the family when illness arrived. It was busy, unglamorous, physically demanding work, and Egyptian culture at its best acknowledged it as skilled and valuable. At its worst, it was simply invisible in the records the way domestic labor tends to be, present in its results, absent in its documentation. Which is, again, not a problem unique to ancient Egypt, just a very old one. Beauty and personal care were also woven into daily life at all social levels. Both men and women wore kohl eyeliner, that thick black line extending to the outer corner of the eye that's become one of the most iconic visual signatures of Egyptian culture. It wasn't purely cosmetic. Kohl, made from galena, a lead-based mineral, actually had some antimicrobial properties and reduced glare from the intense Egyptian sun, functioning as a practical eye protection as much as a decorative one. Oils and fats were applied to skin and hair to protect against the drying effects of sun and desert air. Cones of perfumed wax or fat were sometimes depicted worn on top of wigs at parties, slowly melting and releasing fragrance over the course of an evening, which is either delightful or slightly uncomfortable depending on how you feel about wearing a scented wax hat to a dinner party. Wigs themselves were common among both sexes at higher social levels, thick, elaborate, often beaded constructions worn over shaved or closely cropped natural hair. Lice were a persistent problem in the hot climate, which made keeping hair very short or shaved entirely under a wig a sensible hygienic choice as much as a fashionable one. Combs, razors, mirrors of polished bronze, all of these have been found in tombs and settlement debris, telling us that the basic human impulse toward personal grooming transcended every class and every era with remarkable consistency. So there she is, the Egyptian woman in her full daily texture. Legal owner of property, potential disinheritor of ungrateful children, professional mourner, priestess, physician in some cases, pharaoh in others, and also, on a Tuesday morning, grinding grain on her knees in the courtyard while keeping half an eye on the toddler near the bread oven. Complex, capable, frequently overlooked by history, and in Egypt at least, considerably more legally visible than most of her ancient counterparts elsewhere. Let's float onward, next, into the world of Egyptian children in a bit more depth, their games, their education, their astonishingly familiar toys, and then ease into the great building projects that turned the civilization's labor and faith into stone structures that are still standing, quietly and enormously, along that same river today. Alright, here we are, the final stretch. Eyes probably pretty heavy by now, which is exactly where we want to be. Let's ease through the last few rooms of this very long, very calm museum of Egyptian daily life. The children, the monuments, and then one last slow drift down the river before we let the whole thing go quiet. Children in ancient Egypt, as it turns out, had toys. This sounds obvious, but it's one of those details that lands differently when you're actually looking at the objects, because the toys that have survived from Egyptian archaeological sites are, in many cases, remarkably familiar. Wooden animals with movable jaws, operated by pulling a string, small clay figurines of people and animals, balls made of leather stuffed with grain husks or papyrus, spinning tops, dolls with articulated limbs and painted hair. These are objects that would not look entirely out of place in a basic toy box today, and there's something quietly striking about that. The 3,000-year gap collapsing suddenly into a small wooden crocodile whose jaw snaps open and shut on a little string, made by some Egyptian craftsman for some specific child whose name we will never know. Children played. Obviously they did, but the evidence of it surviving in physical form, pulled out of the sand after millennia, makes it feel less like a historical fact and more like a small, warm proof of something continuous in human experience. People have always made things for children to play with. Children have always dragged those things around and lost them under furniture and left them in odd corners. Some of those corners turned out to be very well preserved. Games that required more than one player were also popular. Wrestling appears constantly in Egyptian art, depicted in long sequential registers on tomb walls and what look almost like ancient instructional diagrams, showing holds, throws, and countermoves with enough detail that historians have actually tried to reconstruct the rules. Swimming was common, given the river, though the Nile's currents and its resident crocodile population presumably kept recreational swimming somewhat geographically selective. Running races, jumping games, and a kind of balance and tumbling activity that looks something like acrobatics appear in various tomb paintings and reliefs, suggesting an active outdoor childhood that was, again, shaped almost entirely by the climate. Outdoors in the cooler early morning, retreating inside or into shade as the midday heat peaked, back out again in the late afternoon. Education for children, as we touched on earlier, varied enormously by class. For the vast majority, education was informal and entirely vocational, boys learning their father's trade by working alongside him from a fairly young age, girls learning household management from their mothers in an equally hands-on apprenticeship model. There were no schools for most Egyptian children in any formal sense. Knowledge was transmitted through doing, through watching, through repetition of the same tasks in the same way across generations. For the small minority who entered scribal training, education was more structured, centered on copying texts, wisdom literature, religious hymns, administrative documents, over and over until the hand knew the forms without conscious effort. It was rote and physical in its demands, requiring fine motor control, good memory, and a fairly high tolerance for sitting still in a dim room copying things. The students who made it through this system emerged with access to one of the most powerful social tools in the entire civilization, literacy, in a world where literacy was rare enough to be almost magical in its practical effects. There's a whole genre of surviving Egyptian texts called the satirical scribal letters, practice compositions in which experienced scribes essentially roast incompetent colleagues or students in elaborate, detailed, and frankly very funny ways, cataloging their failures of knowledge, their poor writing, their inadequate preparation for tasks, and their general uselessness in terms that are surprisingly colorful for documents that were, technically, educational materials. Apparently, the ancient Egyptian method of motivating student scribes included a healthy dose of professional humiliation, which is either a pedagogical approach or just hazing depending on how charitable you're feeling about it. Let's drift, finally and gently, toward the pyramids. Not because they need more attention. They've had quite enough attention, really, they're perfectly capable of generating their own. But because no journey through Egyptian daily life is complete without at least a quiet acknowledgement of what those structures meant to the people who built them and lived in their shadows. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BC, is made of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average around 2.5 to 15 tons, assembled over a period of roughly 20 years with a workforce of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people at its peak construction phases. Not slaves, as we established in Part 1. Paid workers, fed, housed, given medical care. Archaeologists found the remains of the workers' settlement at Giza, including a bakery capable of producing enormous quantities of bread daily and evidence of cattle, sheep, and goat bones suggesting regular meat consumption. These were not starved conscripts. They were a mobilized national workforce, fed better than most ordinary Egyptians ate, doing something that was understood as an act of cosmic importance, helping the pharaoh prepare for his divine transition, and in doing so, helping maintain the ma'at that kept the whole civilization functioning. There's graffiti on some of the pyramid stones, left by the work gangs, casual, cheerful inscriptions identifying their crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, which is possibly the best piece of ancient graffiti in existence. The idea that the people hauling limestone blocks in the Egyptian desert had enough of a sense of collective identity, and enough of a sense of humor to name their crew, the Drunkards, and scratch it into the stone is one of those details that makes the whole vast, intimidating structure suddenly feel deeply human. The pyramids weren't built in isolation, of course. Each was part of a larger complex. A valley temple at the river's edge, a causeway leading up to a mortuary temple, and then the pyramid itself, surrounded eventually by smaller pyramids for queens and mastaba tombs for officials who wanted to spend eternity in proximity to their king. It was a whole planned landscape of death and remembrance, designed to function as an active religious site for generations after the pharaoh's burial. Priests would maintain the mortuary cult for decades, sometimes centuries, performing daily rituals and food offerings at the mortuary temple, funded by estates set aside specifically for that purpose. The intention was permanence, care for the dead king in perpetuity, maintaining the relationship between the living and the divine across time. Eventually, of course, the funding dried up, the priests moved on, and the mortuary cults quietly faded. The pyramids stayed, because stone is patient and the Egyptian desert is dry and the things built to last actually did. The Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, which is a record so enormous that it barely registers as a real number. 4,000 years. The pyramid was already ancient when Rome was founded. It was already ancient when Alexander the Great visited and was reportedly quietly impressed. It was already ancient when Cleopatra lived. She was chronologically closer to us than to the pyramid's construction, which is the kind of fact that reorganizes your mental timeline fairly dramatically. Let's ease into the temples now, since they represent the other great building tradition of Egyptian civilization, and one that continued right to the end of the pharaonic period in ways the pyramid building largely did not. The great temple complexes, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, Edfu, Philae, were centuries-long building projects, each pharaoh adding a pylon here, a hall there, a new sanctuary, a new obelisk, layering contributions on top of contributions until the complexes sprawled across enormous areas of land and dense accumulations of stone that took lifetimes to fully explore even for the priests who worked within them. Karnak, dedicated primarily to Ammonius, is probably the most staggering example. A site that was continuously built upon for roughly 2,000 years, resulting in a complex so vast that the main temple alone could comfortably contain most European cathedrals within its footprint. The hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, each column carved and painted with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions, remains one of the most physically overwhelming interior spaces ever constructed by human hands. Walking through it, even as a modern tourist with good shoes and a water bottle, apparently produces a specific kind of awed silence in even the most photographically determined visitor. Obelisks were another signature Egyptian contribution to the monumental landscape. Tall, tapering, four-sided pillars of single-cut granite, capped with an electrum or gold-covered pyramidion that caught the first light of the sun each morning. They were quarried from the granite beds at Aswan, floated downriver on enormous barges, and hauled upright into position at temple entrances through feats of engineering organization that we still don't have completely figured out. Several of them now stand in cities far from Egypt. Rome has more ancient Egyptian obelisks than Egypt does, a fact that says quite a lot about the Roman habit of collecting impressive things from everywhere they conquered. One stands in Paris, one in New York's Central Park, one in London. Quiet, enormous, somewhat out of place in their new contexts, but still carrying their original inscriptions about pharaohs and gods and the eternal maintenance of Ma'at, in a city whose traffic flows around them with complete indifference. And that's perhaps a fitting place to let things rest, actually. The idea of these enormous, quietly insistent remnants of Egyptian civilization sitting in the middle of modern cities, carved with messages about divine order and cosmic balance, while taxis and tourists and pigeons flow around them completely unconcerned. Because that's what Egyptian civilization does to you eventually. It makes you aware of scale, of time, of how long things have been going on, and how much of it has been, at its core, very ordinary. Bread and beer, grain and flood, children with wooden toys, women grinding flour in the early morning quiet, scribes bent over papyrus in flickering lamplight, workers carving their crew name into a pyramid stone because why not leave a mark? Because humans have always wanted to leave a mark. Because being here felt like it meant something and they wanted there to be evidence of it. Turtle, 3,000 years of daily life along a river that still flows north, still floods in its seasonal rhythms, still runs green and brown and full of silt through a landscape that is simultaneously the same and completely transformed. The Nile doesn't particularly care about any of it, which is maybe the most Egyptian thought of all. The river just keeps going, the mud keeps settling, and somewhere underneath the accumulated weight of all that history, the grain still grows in the black land, just as it always has. Alright, that's Egypt. All of it, or as much of it as fits in an evening. Hopefully your eyes are doing exactly what T. Harry's supposed to be doing right now. Hopefully the Nile is somewhere in your half-dreams, slow and wide and brown in the afternoon light, with a small wooden boat drifting on it going absolutely nowhere in particular. That's the right place to be. Sleep well. We'll find another civilization to drift through next time.